About Mary Anita Nordale. I've known Mary for 25 years. She's a longtime Fairbanksan, but she also spent a lot of her time early years in Juneau. She's a Juneau Fairbanks person, and she knows lots of people in Juneau as well as Fairbanks. She comes from a distinguished family, but you know they're putting her in the Alaska Women's Hall of Fame. You probably know that on October 16th, and she has many accomplishments. She's a real self-starter. She's given credit for helping convince people to establish the corporate concept in the ANCSA Act, and that's true, although she's much more modest about that, and I'll speak to that a little bit. And many other, she was on the Frank Initiative. I think she actually helped organize that. And you'll see, I'll talk about all her main accomplishments, but I'm going to focus because I know her a different side to her, and that is that she's been heavily connected with Alaska's mining industry as a mining lawyer for more than 45 years. And I'll talk a little bit about the history of the family and then some of her accomplishments, and I'll try to get through in the time allotted.
I'll give you 5 minutes.
Okay. I'll talk about the roots of the Nordale family. It really all started in the interior. Antoine Tony Nordale and his wife, Anne Mathilda, were Swedish immigrants. They came up into the North Country, mainly first Juneau, but with the Klondike gold discoveries, they headed north, initially into the Klondike, and later settled in the Fairbanks area. It's a talk all by itself. I'm not going to go into the details. This is Tony and his wife, and then there's Helmar and Arnold and Alton. This is Mary's dad, and Anita and Alice in this picture that was taken around 1915. The Nordale family, what is mainly known for was the construction of hotels. Tony built the Grand Hotel in Cleary City in 1906. That was a major camp in the Fairbanks mining district. It took me years to find a decent photograph of this thing. I just got it recently from Marilyn Nordale Stacy. And then later, more famously, the Nordale Hotel. This is the first Nordale Hotel, was partially burned down and rebuilt. The second Nordale Hotel, for history, it actually appeared in the movie Ice Palace, if you ever saw that. So he was mainly involved, not in mining so much, but find support for mining. I want to show you about the mining roots, and maybe you ask, well, why would Mary become associated with mining? Well, this is a picture in 1905 of a drift mine shaft near Cleary in north of Fairbanks. It shows on the left Arnold, Helmar, Anita, and then this little kid with the gold pan was Mary's father in 1905. And so, I wanted to show you quickly, all 4 boys of the original Nordale family were involved in the mining industry. Arnold Nordale was the biggest boy of all, and he went to Stanford, came back before there was an Alaska Agricultural College and School of Mines. He quickly rose up into important management and technical positions in the United States Smelting, Refining, and Mining Company that operated a large gold fleet in Fairbanks and also in Nome. He essentially designed their exploration programs. Later, he assumed management in the Yukon Consolidated Gold Corporation fleet in Dawson. They had 10 dredges, and he eventually managed that. So he was a really important character in the mining business. Alfred Helmar pursued underground gold developments in the Fairbanks and Kantishna areas. That's another story. Alton Nordale, his Mary's father, worked with Helmar on gold properties in the Cleary Hill area. And Adler, the youngest kid, eventually was the general manager of the old High-U and McCarty gold mines in the Fairbanks Creek Basin, which were 2 of the largest underground mines in the Fairbanks area prior to the Second World War. So I'm just pointing this out to you, that a strong connection to the mining business. And the Nordales were really important figures in public service, and they were all interested in public service. Tony Nordale was mayor of Fairbanks in 1910 and 11, territorial legislature later on. He was the first guy to be appointed to the Board of Trustees of the Alaska Agricultural College and School of Mines. Alton Nordale, Mary's father, served in the territorial legislature. Alfred Halmar was the mayor of Fairbanks in the 1920s. He was also in the territorial legislature, and he actually was the editor of the Fairbanks Daily News-Miner for a while. Nordale Elementary School in Fairbanks is named in his honor. Arnold Nordale was the mayor, also a mayor of Fairbanks, and while mayor, he championed the cause of the building a modern school. He fought for it because there was some dragging their feet. This is now the administrator's office building of the city of Fairbanks, and he really worked very hard on that. And then James Nordale, Mary's brother, was the attorney for Anchorage and the chief attorney for the Kenai Peninsula and Fairbanks North Star boroughs. Now, I've talked to lots of people. If you're complaining about the borough in Fairbanks, it's probably Jim's fault, because he basically designed the thing with John Carlson, the first borough mayor. And then Catherine Driscoll Nordale, Mary's mother, was one of 5 women to serve as a delegate on the Alaska Constitutional Convention. And she was quite an interesting gal. You could give a talk just like this all about her. This is these pictures. Alton Nordale, Mary's father, was killed in an airplane crash when she was 3 years old. She didn't know her dad. He was coming back from Discovery Days in Dawson. They had a celebration of the gold discovery like we do in Fairbanks Golden Days today. And he got caught in the head of the Goodpasture River in bad weather and was killed. And so it left Mary's mom, Catherine Driscoll Nordale, with 2 kids, Jim and Mary, to take care of. You know, in the 1930s, it wasn't that easy for a woman to take care of kids. It just wasn't. They did not have the kind of support facilities that they do today. So she went initially. After his death, she worked at the new courthouse in Fairbanks, and then later moved to Juneau and became very and heavily involved in a number of civic activities. This is a young picture of Mary Nordale right out of high school. I got this from the Polar Regions. Katie Hurley once told me that Mary Nordale, right out of high school, she was smart. She was a hard worker, and the word I never forget the word. She was glamorous. That's what she said. Anyways, so what is the career of Mary Nordale? She got a BS degree in Gonzaga University in 1957. She was importantly, in a very important part of her life, she was the staff member of U.S. Senator E.L. Bob Bartlett in 1968. And I think it's fair to say that Mary Nordale worshiped Bob Bartlett. She said he was the best thing that ever happened to Alaska, and she'd say that right now. He was the perfect guy for statehood. And then she attended law school and graduated with a law degree from George Washington University in 1966. And not to make the Nordale and Bartlett families were close. Bob Bartlett's dad worked as a teamster in the Circle Mining District. He hauled freight for small firms. The Bartletts knew the Nordale family members from their involvement in the mining industry, but also in other business interactions. Bob Bartlett married Vida Gaustad. Vida's father, was also a journalist for the News-Miner, but he also was a gold miner in the Fairbanks area. So you can see the interactions between the two. So what is... Now we're getting into what was Mary Nordale's post-Washington, D.C. career after Bob Bartlett unfortunately passed away in 1968 at a relatively young age, of the early 60s. She was a Attorney General or a U.S. Attorney for Interior Alaska. She was Assistant State of Alaska District Attorney in the late 60s and early 70s. She was counsel to the U.S. Small Business Administration in the early 70s. She helped draft and codes for the small business corporations here in Alaska. She helped develop the Fairbanks Resource Agencies that dealt with the problems associated with the 67 flood in Fairbanks. I've been told that she basically set up the whole thing. This is something that people say that I think she may have got into the Women's Hall of Fame. She embedded the concept of a corporate concept for the 13 regional native corporations Well, while Bob Bartlett was still alive. Remember, they knew that there was going to be legislation that would pass Congress, and they were trying to figure out what would be the best model to approach. I just recently asked Mary about this. She says, yeah, I was involved in that. I'm proud of it. But there was a few other people that were also involved, so I don't want to take full credit. And that's typical Mary. That's just who she was. She wanted to accurately state exactly what happened. The reason why I'm giving this talk today is she began to specialize in business and mining law, and she actually was very active for more than 40 years. I mean, through the law office of Birch, Horton, Mittner, and Chereau, she wasn't actually a partner, but she was in counsel. They gave her an office in the Key Bank building in Fairbanks, and I can tell you that office was very busy all the time, mainly because the small mining companies really wanted her advice, legal advice, and she drew up many, many contracts. I'm not saying she didn't do anything for big corporations, but her focus was small companies. And she served as the Commissioner of Revenue under Bill Sheffield. She was the statewide president of the Alaska Miners Association. She was the first woman to hold that office, and I think she was a game changer. She made differences there. She was a longtime advisory board member of the Alaska School of Engineering and Mines on the campus of the University of Alaska. And I have to say, my involvement with her, she's a founding board member of the Alaska Mining Hall of Fame Foundation in 1997. She drew up the bylaws and articles of incorporation, and she served as its president for almost 10 years. And the latest thing is she won a seat on the Interior Gas Utilities Board in 2018, and that was a competitive election. So what is her involvement as mining counsel? After ANCSA was passed and after ANILCA was passed, the political landscape in Alaska began to radically change. Small mining companies, even larger mining companies, had to comply with many new regulations involving land use, reclamation, water quality, mine safety. Resolution of the 6I lawsuit in 89-90 also changed the political landscape from the state of Alaska's perspective. And all this required a lawyer, basically, for a small company to operate. They didn't have to deal with these issues before, and she really helped them out quite a bit. This is a quote I got from Dave Wright, who a well-known operator here in the Fairbanks area, operated for more than 40 years. Mary would, reviewed the contracts between his company and partnerships. She went all over the contracts, pointed out changes. When big corporations were trying to change things, Mary said, don't change those. I mean, it wasn't just, there was a different way of looking at things between a corporate arena and a small company arena, and she made sure everything was correct. And she did that many, many times. One of the things that I'm going to talk about a little bit today, one of the small companies that dealt with her was NB Tweet and Sons, based in Nome. It's a third generation company. It's been operating almost continuously since 1898. And kids, grandkids, great-grandkids of the original locators of Nick and Avenda Tweet. And during the World War I, it goes back a long ways, and even up to World War II, small lots of very high-grade graphite was located by this company. They mined it, got it down to the Immerok Basin, put it on a barge, and sold it to buyers in San Francisco at a profit. They actually made some money doing this. They also understood it was a unique deposit. They were smart enough to see these kind of deposits don't occur everywhere. So they maintained their federal mining claims very carefully and did all the proper assessment work and the fees that were required to do that for decades of time. So, turn the page, 21st century, we're beginning to reach graphite's very important to the production of electric cars, fuel cell and other technologies, and suddenly the interest arises. What did NB Tweet and Sons do? They got a hold of Mary Nordale and said, please help us with this, drafting up this a lease agreement with the companies so that we're protected and that we can move forward on this, and that's exactly what you did. It started in 2011, and I thought I'd show you a few things. Since then, millions of dollars of exploration have been spent, hundreds of drill holes, a lot of complicated geophysics. They've determined a strike length of 18 kilometers of this graphite-bearing unit. And in a very small part of it, less than a kilometer of it, they've determined that these are the kinds of grades, 150 million tons of very good grade graphite, which, by the way, is an excellent grade if you were going to try to develop this kind of thing. And I thought I'd show you, just to show you what is it being used for. It's used for lithium graphite batteries. Every one of these cars requires about 100 pounds of graphite. And so that this is going to be one of these new technologies that will show up in the future. And thought I'd show you something else. This is a quote from the United States Geological Survey. This deposit, originally a tweak deposit, is the largest plate graphite deposit in the United States. It's one of the largest in the world. So, and it's being explored and developed right now. And it'll take time to get it all up. I think the latest idea is that the original concentrate will eventually go to Ohio, where it will be processed for the auto industry. So this is basically an example of, it's not just small gold miners, but just any old small company that Mary worked with over many years to make sure that they were taken care of. Mary was the statewide president of the Alaska Miners Association. I apologize, these aren't very good images. It was different. We think now, that's only 30 years ago, but things were different. There'd never been a woman being the AMA president before. And they only usually had presidents for 1 year. But because she was so good at her job, they kept her for 2 years. This is a picture of Mary and the late Earl Beislein in 1994, and this is her first board meeting of AMA in November of 1994. I just asked Mary very recently about what her ideas were about what had she accomplished as AMA president. She says, well, we had to keep abreast increasingly complex compliance issues for both large and small mining companies. But when I took my helm, the pro and anti-resource development people weren't talking to each other. It was so polarized that there was no discussions. So at least by the time I ended, they were talking to people and sitting down and talking and ironing out their various grievances. And as she said in the last sentence, they may not have agreed on much of anything, but at least they were talking to each other. And that was a good comment for Mary to make. Mary, myself, Earl Beislein, Chuck Hawley, and a few others got together in 1997 and formed the Alaska Mining Hall of Fame Foundation. Mary drew up all the paperwork, and there was a lot of paperwork, very complicated. And she did such a beautiful job, we had no problems with any aspect of it. It was signed by Willie Hensley under the Knowles administration. And typical of Mary, though, she didn't, I've looked through all the articles of incorporation, her name was barely mentioned, but yet she did it all. So, I mean, it's just typical, almost not wanting to take credit for things like that. One of the first things she did, we had our first induction ceremony in Fairbanks in 1998. Morris Thompson, the late Morris Thompson, was the convened it. And we asked Morris, who should we induct first? In fact, Mary asked first. And he said, well, if you want to get this thing started, induct the traders, Al Mayo, Jack McQuestion, MacArthur, and others. And then, a few others like here, John Minnock, who discovered the Rampart Mining District. And with his prestigious, he has a family of 7 or 8 kids there. And I've been told that he taught every one of them to be a prospector. And he discovered other areas throughout that part of interior Alaska. So he is actually the first guy that we put into the Alaska Mining Hall of Fame. And I thought I'd just let you know that because of his ability to be stake claims and keep claims, that became an argument a couple of decades later about how Native Americans were entitled to be U.S. citizens. Remember, they weren't U.S. citizens until 1924, and they used this example: you have to be a citizen to hold a mining claim. So since he's got a mining claim, well, he goes back that it must be that Native Americans can own mining claims, and that was a court case in the Ninth Circuit. One of the things that Mary liked to do when she was president of the Alaska Mining Hall of Fame, she was very fond of this special connection that Fairbanks has with Fanano, Italy, the birthplace of Felix Pedro. And if some of you know from Fairbanks, there's this really interesting relationship that we have to this day. It shows here, she organized a tour with John Eberhardt, the mayor of Fairbanks at the time, and Mayor Stefano Mazzarelli. He was the mayor of Fanano, of our museum there. And later, one of Felix Pedro's great nephews came over with his family, and he penned a big nugget, by the way, up by the Discovery Claim, and he made a ring out of it. And it goes on to this day, and we just found out Stefano Mazzarelli just won re-election as mayor of Fanano, Italy, and I'm sure we'll be seeing more and more of that family. He loves to come over for the dog races in the wintertime, and he actually spends quite a fair amount of time in Fairbanks. And so, as I conclude this talk, this is a picture. I apologize, it's not a very good picture of Mary and my co-author, Jerry Macbeth. And if there's questions, please answer. I'll be happy to answer.
Thanks, Tom. That was great. That was really informative. So thanks a lot. We're going to do questions afterwards, if that's okay with everybody. So why don't we just wait, but we'll have you come up here. Our next speaker is Garrett Verbeek. And Garrett is he calls himself a history nerd. He's a former petroleum engineer and planner and a real history buff. And he's going to be speaking about mine claiming ownership over Matanuska coal in the early 20th century. So looking at kind of a different form of economic development. So.
Cool. Thanks, guys. As soon as they announced the theme of rights and responsibilities, I said, I know the story for this. Because this, as you guys will see, is kind of a microcosm of every aspect of who has rights and what are the responsibilities of federal government, and also the importance of timing. So a lot of the stuff that Fran was discussing this morning. So we'll give 1 second.
Hold on, I'm just doing the Zoom thing. You keep going.
Okay. Yeah, the title of this is Mine, Claiming Ownership Over Matanuska Coal. And basically I come at this, I've worked as a planner for the Matsu Borough, but I come at this more from the perspective of working on a project called the Chospler Project, which is looking at the history of Alaska through the history of place names. And I think that basically what a network of place names tells you in an area, it gives you a really good insight into how people moved into an area, what they were looking for there, and how they kind of approached it.
It is not advancing yet.
Okay.
Try this. Try now.
Now, okay.
No.
Okay.
So
No,
we're here from all over a very big state. So the places that we're going to be looking at is the Matanuska River, which you guys will recognize probably as the Glen Highway Corridor, and that kind of runs up from Tidewater and Knick Arm to towards the Copper River Basin. And we're also going to tie into something that's just around the corner from here, the Bering River, which is across the Copper River a couple miles, well, not a couple miles, but fairly close in. So if we look at this 1910 map of the Matanuska River Valley, and keeping in mind, like, we're approaching this from the perspective of place names, we see that one of the biggest features there is called Anthracite Ridge. And also notice there's a Coal Creek and a Carbon Creek. And we start saying, okay, someone was interested in coal. Some of the first English speakers into this valley were interested in coal. And this is risky, guys. A graph in a presentation is always risky, but I have faith in us. This is a very good graph that was put together, which is U.S. energy consumption by source from 1780 to 2010. So this is percentages of where U.S. energy came from. And we kind of have three phases, right? This starts from 1780 And in 1780, it was wood, food, and fodder, right, for animals. And it continues that way for a long time. And then we have kind of a coal mountain, this black mountain that comes up really, really quickly and ends also fairly quickly. And that transitions into the familiar oil, gas. This cuts off in 2010, so there's some nuclear renewables haven't quite hit the scene yet. So there are two things that we're going to keep in mind as we project ourselves back to 1898, which is the year of the Glenn military expedition that went up the Matanuska Valley for the first time. And that's kind of a good jumping off point for this presentation. Two things to keep in mind. Wood, food, and fodder. This graph starts in 1780, but you could draw those lines back to the Bronze Age and it would be accurate, right? It was always wood, food, and fodder. So we're used to this concept of, we've heard about oil and gas, we're hearing about renewables, we're hearing about nuclear. Our life is filled with energy transitions, but the transition to coal starting in 1820s was something new. This was like literally unprecedented in 10,000 years of in 10,000 years of world history, that we had something that was incredibly like a powerful new energy source. And it hit hard. Basically by the peak in 1920, it was, it had more of the, it captured more of the energy markets than oil and gas combined do today. It was a bigger part of it. By 1920, a workforce of about 300,000 people in America were mining 650 million tons of coal per day. Or per year, sorry, which is approaching 2 million tons per day. So 1898, what else was going on? And this is kind of going over, these are the responsibilities that the federal government in the late 19th century might have perceived. They had a responsibility to provide their nation with energy. They were also looking at expansion. And 1898 also happens to be kind of the high year of American empire in a lot of ways. That was the year that the US annexed Hawaii. It was the year that the U.S. took over the Philippines, like on the very far side of the Pacific. It was the year that we fought and took over Cuba and Puerto Rico. And there's an interesting twist here, right? Because basically all of this was made possible with coal, a coal-fired navy in a lot of cases. Really interesting twist. This is a map of coal fields of the United States. There has never been any significant coal discovered west of the Rockies, ever. So if we think back to 1898, and if we think about a steam-fired navy expanding America's dominance across the Pacific and all of the industries that are developing on the West Coast, and the fact that there's no coal west of the Rockies, we start seeing the excitement, the potential that Americans would have seen if we could discover big coal deposits close to tidewater in Alaska. All of a sudden, this map, like if your previous sources of coal end here, and you discover coal right there, that instantly makes all of this far more feasible. So kind of in context now, we started with the purchase of Alaska in 1867, and coal was rapidly coming on. By 1898, when we have all of this focus on the Pacific and focus on coal, coal has taken over quite a bit of the market share. 1894 is when Americans learn of coal in the Matanuska Valley for the first time. And 1896 is when Americans first learned of coal in the Bering River. So this is a very, very exciting time, and a lot of people are seeing dollar signs. So what else is the federal government looking at? While people are seeing dollar signs, the federal government at this point in time is also really focused on conservation. This is the era of Teddy Roosevelt. There is an excellent book by a guy named Douglas Brinkley called The Wilderness Warrior, which is Roosevelt's career as a conservationist. And it makes a very interesting point in there that Roosevelt and his contemporaries were the first civil servants, the first generation of college-educated people who were educated with the origin of species as college textbook. And they're seeing extinctions in real time, in their own lifetime, right? The multiple species went extinct. The great auk went extinct in '52. The American bison came very close, from 60 million animals estimated down to a low point of 541 in the entire United States. The passenger pigeon, which apparently used to be, that would black out the sky on the East Coast with its migrations, had gone extinct. And in response, they started forming, that's the era of the Boone and Crockett Club, which was hunters advocating for conservation, and the Audubon Society, which was advocating against feathers in fashion. And we start seeing a lot more of these conservation districts, especially when Roosevelt assumes the presidency. So here we have Roosevelt and Muir in Yellowstone in famous 1903 photo. And we also have this gentleman, Gifford Pinchot, who was, after Roosevelt was reelected, he was the first director of the Forest Service. And basically this administration, their concept was that they would take executive power and they would use it to basically force conservation across the United States by hook or by crook. They saw that this was a very critical thing. So we have two competing ideas. Okay, we have energy, we have all of this desire to produce resources, and then we also have the conservation movement. And these things are going to butt heads with rights and responsibilities. Then there's also a recession. There was the Panic of 1893 to 1897, which was kind of a run on the banks. It's very hard to actually find good images for this. There's a lot of stuff from the 30s. There aren't very many good images from 1893. So this is a cartoon, but it was a serious deal. It impacted industrial production by quite a bit. It raised national unemployment to like somewhere on the order of 20%, and that was on average. It hit the Midwest particularly hard. So like in Michigan, unemployment was over 40%. And as Fran pointed out today, a lot of times we know that when times get tough, people start looking around at public resources and they start saying, okay, well, what can we sell? What can we cut down? What can we extract? How can these public resources serve us? So there were these very big debates in the nation of what is the right level of conservation? How can we get energy? How can we get jobs? And imagine projecting ourselves back to 1898, if you've just gone through a depression and you start hearing about coal in Alaska, gold in Alaska, how that might drive the rushes to those areas of the world. So that kind of goes over the picture of responsibilities that a federal government might have. So who now has the rights to do this? And very similar to the concept of Alaska Inc., the mining law of 1872 was really designed to give the little guy power. It basically was designed that any American citizen could stake up to 160 acres of coal. The key clause here that's going to come in handy throughout this presentation is there could be only one entry by the same person or association of persons. This was designed by the federal government to be something for the little guy. Corporations were not supposed to be allowed. And this was expanded to the territory of Alaska in 1900, originally on surveyed land. Then after some complaints that surveys weren't being expanded fast enough, in 1904, the Alaska Coal Act extended the rights to stake these claims on unsurveyed lands, which is the Matanuska River Valley at the time. So that takes us up to the discovery of coal. In 1904, it was fair game. You could start staking it. And we have two really amazing resources combined. The Anchorage Museum has the Robert Wheatley collection, which is a photograph album of hundreds of photographs from 1906 to 1908 in this area. And in 2004, the state DNR ran around the entire state and they started scanning in the mining claims books, which basically, in the time, if you wanted to mine, you had to say mine. You had to stake a claim and then bring it to a local district recorder and get it put on paper. The district recorder for Connecticut at that point in time was this gentleman, John Goodell. And as many Alaskans, he worked quite a few jobs, and every once in a while, he would also, write down a homestead claim or something in this recorder's book for a couple of dollars. It was supposed to be a side gig. On February 5th of 1906, I imagine he had probably just come back from vacation. A gentleman called Frank Watson walks into John Goodell's office, and he drops a stack of 41 claims on the guy's desk. This is one of the first recorder's books that's written on a typewriter, and I am incredibly grateful that John had a typewriter because the previous recorder's books, handwriting was not a consideration for the job. And if you're lucky, it's legible. If you're unlucky, it's awful. But again, I guess kind of tying back to researching the history of place names, these are a gold mine, figuratively and literally, for figuring out where place names came from. But anyway, so Frank Watson comes in and he drops this stack of 41 claims because you were allowed to work as an attorney, as a representative for other people. And that kind of gets into some sticky scenarios, as we'll hear in a second. The same day, TJ Munley, another agent for a lot of people, drops something like 15 claims on John's desk. So we got like 56 claims in the Matanuska Valley at the same time, all for 160 acres each. And then a little while later, Frank Watson follows up with another stack of claims several months later. So essentially, within a year after it's open, all of the good Matanuska Valley coal land is staked out. And this, I think this is an incredible photograph. Like, look at the detail on this. This is another one from the Robert Wheatley collection. Frank Watson is this gentleman in the middle. And there's an Easter egg here, because right behind these guys, there is a warning about forest fires posted on the building, which is probably the recorder's office. And that ties back into these concerns about forest conservation and rights and responsibilities, and what the Roosevelt administration at the same time was picturing for Alaska, which is substantially different than what people like Frank Watson were picturing for Alaska. There was another group of people running around at the same time, though. This is Nikita, who was a chief of Kinnick. I haven't verified this with Aaron Leggett yet. I regret that I didn't have time to prepare as much for this presentation as I wanted to. But basically, all indications are that Nikita was basically what's called a Kashka, which is a Dene chief who's responsible for resource distribution in the village, a central pillar of the community. So we have Nikita standing here behind the tent, little Nikita, his son, and they were a big family in the Matanuska area. Unfortunately, as we just heard from Thomas, they were barred from ownership of resources in a lot of ways. And we have this comforting myth in Alaska that the natives were, innocent children of nature, and they didn't care about natural resources, and they didn't see any value in gold and coal. And that's nonsense. We can basically see, if we look at the contemporary sources, the first USGS reports about Matanuska coal, G.C. Martin, who was a USGS geologist, basically said, hey, the occurrence of coal was first learned by the Indians in 1894, right? So we have 1894, the Indians came in and said, hey, you guys know there's coal out there. We have contemporary reports from newspapers in 1902 and in 1897 that Indians from Susitna Station were prospecting for gold back into the 1880s, all the way up and down the Susitna Basin into the Alaska Range. In 1897, the year before the Glen expedition blazed a trail up the Matanuska Valley, there's this wonderful newspaper report that a group of 20 miners were waiting at Knik for the Atna to come through on their trading expedition. And their concept was they were going to follow that group back up the river to figure out how to navigate it and to look for where they got their gold from. So here, if we're talking about rights and responsibilities, if we can imagine that the natives would have had the right to stake gold claims at a time when they had every advantage in knowledge of the landscape, in knowledge of how to travel over land, in kinship networks, how different this might have looked. The distribution of wealth, the politics, that type of thing. However, so we have kind of a series of laws, and basically this presentation is kind of like a watercolor painting in a lot of ways, where you try to draw a neat little circle around something and it just bleeds, and tendrils spread everywhere. And this is one of those watercolor tendrils where we can't really focus on this. Instead of watercolors, we have to focus on charcoal today. But essentially in 1906, you have the Native Allotment Act, which was the first opportunity for natives to claim legal ownership over land. However, one of the provisions was that you had to live on the land for 5 consecutive years with seasonal occupation not allowed. And that was substantially incompatible with the Dene way of life, which was traveling large annual circuits between fish camp, between hunting grounds. So essentially, okay, yeah, it was an option, but barred. Similarly, in 1915, that was the first legal pathway for individual natives to achieve American citizenship. However, again, it required endorsements from 5 white citizens, and it also required you to have severed all tribal relationships and adapted the habits of a civilized life. So the option was, give up your family, give up everything you know for citizenship. Not really an option. But again, some interesting things. And this has real ramifications, right? So this is a gentleman named Charles Ulanke, who basically one of John Goodell's first pages in this book, page 7, is the Ulanke homestead. And it has a little footnote in there at the bottom. This was a 320-acre homestead that was claimed by Charles Ulanke. And the footnote at the bottom, it's a note by the recorder, it says, hey, said homestead includes a fishing station and improvements on Fish Creek used by the native Indians of the Kinnick tribe. So basically, this guy just came in and he drew a line around the community center, essentially, the fish camp that was used by natives. And he said, hey, this is now my land. And we see this has real ramifications, guys. In 1930, this is a Freddie de Laguna photo. This is the camp of Little Nikita. That's the boy that we saw in the photograph a little while ago. And it is looking across to Ulanke's farm on Fish Creek in 1930. And I would venture that little Nikita's camp probably had very little durable legal stand. So we can imagine, if you can claim 320 acres per head of household, we can start thinking for rights and responsibilities, how different Alaska might have looked if 8 heads of household in Knik at the time, all indigenous natives, could have claimed thousands and thousands of acres that now go for something like $50,000 an acre in downtown Wasilla. There's a very fascinating story here, though, and I have not tracked this down yet. But in 1906, one coal claim was staked by Nikita. And Nikita, if you look, he is very clearly a full-blooded indigenous man. This is theoretically 10 years before there was any path to citizenship. There is a fascinating story somewhere in here, and we see a few of these examples around Alaska, where by possibly just respect of the community or something, it tended to be for chiefs that it was offered, but a few people managed to wrangle citizenship as natives. And I don't know what the story here is, but there's something fascinating. But again, this is watercolors. But this is something that's worth tracking down. How did an indigenous chief, how was he recognized as a citizen and able to stake a mineral claim in 1906? But anyway, this is a very rare example. And for the most part, it was not an option. So anyway, now we're up to 1904 is when the coal lines were opened. By 1905 to 1906, everything was staked out in the Matanuska Valley. And we're still climbing the mountain of coal. At this point, we're getting very close to the peak of coal. But again, if we project ourselves back into the time, if we were living in 1906, we can't see any of this. We can't predict it. All we've seen is that coal is going up and up and up. But there was something else at stake. In 1906, you might be wondering, okay, we have all this activity in the Matanuska Valley. As you guys know, there's not been a lot of development. What happened? In 1906, Teddy Roosevelt, by executive order, stopped any kind of coal activity in the Matanuska Valley and in Alaska. And it was over concerns about corporatism. It was over concerns about conservation. And in 1907, on July 23rd, Roosevelt establishes Chugach National Forest. At the time, it's nearly 5 million acres. It's the second largest in the U.S., and it includes where we're sitting right now. So it kind of occupies this large area. So Roosevelt, while all of the people, all the American citizens here are interested in making money and they're interested in coal and they're very excited to do this, Roosevelt's administration is really trying to shut this down by executive order by any which way out of concerns for conservation. He goes one step further. 1 week before he leaves office in 1909, Roosevelt actually doubles the size of the Chugach State Park. And this was rolled back in the 1920s and 30s, so a lot of people aren't aware of this, but this entire green area was once envisioned as the Chugach National Forest. I'm sorry, I said state park, which is 12 million acres, 11.3 million acres. And as you guys can see, this includes Anchorage, it includes all of the Kenai Peninsula. This includes about 30% of the modern population of the state of Alaska. It would be closer to 50%, but the Matanuska Valley is slightly out of that. So Palmer and Wasilla are slightly outside. And when we're talking about rights and responsibilities, this is a substantially different vision for what Alaska could be. So this vision of this kind of topic of Matanuska coal gives us a whole bunch of different outlets of like, if things had been slightly different, how many different ways Alaska could have gone in. So this was the high points of the Chugach National Forest. This was rolled back substantially by subsequent presidents, but this is, within the last 110 years, a real vision for what this area of Alaska would have looked like. And it was very different than what we see now. So now we are in this area, kind of at the plateau. We have our executive order stopping production. We've established 1907 Chugach National Forest. In 1909, it hits the high point. So this is kind of the peak of the conservation movement, that from Washington, D.C., and from a lot of concern, a real, rational concern about conservation, they're saying, hey guys, hold on, we should maybe not produce these natural resources as fast as possible. So how does this all play out? It's coming together. Basically, in 1909, news breaks about the Ballinger-Pinchot scandal. And as you guys might know, Ballinger-Pinchot scandal was right around the corner from here in the Bering River. Something played out where the Cunningham series of coal claims had been staked by a gentleman named Cunningham. As we've learned from the Mining Act of 1872, The Mining Act was fully envisioned to be individual prospectors producing their own 160 acres, rights for the little guy, no corporations. And it turns out that Cunningham was collecting by power of attorney all of these claims on behalf of people who are very connected to the Guggenheim Corporation. It includes basically there was a former governor of Washington State was one of the claimants, one of the investors. He went to Taft's Secretary of the Interior, Ballinger, and kind of said, "Hey, look, can we move this along?" Like there had basically been a provision where if you had staked claims prior to Roosevelt's moratorium, those would still be honored. And that's what he was going to Ballinger to get approved. At the time, though, Pinchot had joined the Taft administration from the Roosevelt administration, and Pinchot was still very much, rabid is a loaded word, but he was a very zealous conservationist. And he still believed in the Rooseveltian vision of conservation, which is basically by hook or by crook, executive order, no matter what the law says, that they have a responsibility to conserve as much land as possible. So Ballinger approved the Cunningham claims. Pinchot said, no, this is corporatism, this is favoritism. Eventually, Pinchot took the concerns to the Court of Public Opinion, which by publishing this in Collier's, and it was a massive scandal, right? This basically kind of broke the federal government in a lot of ways. Ballinger resigned in disgrace. The Court of Public Opinion held the conservation side of things. Ballinger resigned in disgrace. Taft had to fire Pinchot for insubordination. That set up a massive rift between Taft and Roosevelt, where you guys might recall Roosevelt later came back in as the Bull Moose candidate, campaigning against his own party. So this is a big watershed moment, not least of which because this was a massive scandal because it put the idea in a lot of Americans' heads that the federal government was working on behalf of corporate interests. And as we all know, like this has echoes into today's society. When people think that the federal government is acting on behalf of corporate interests, people get mad, especially if it's something like the Mining Act of 1872, which was supposed to be for the little guy that is being exploited this way. So the Ballinger-Pinchot scandal is fairly well known, but what we don't know is there was a very similar scandal in the Matanuska Valley, right? So when when Watson walked in and he dropped those 41 claims on Goodell's desk, it turns out that he was staking all of these on behalf of a gentleman named Arthur C. Frost, who was one of the principal investors in the Alaska Northern Railway. And it also turns out this was a Chicago-based organization. In this article from the Seward Daily Gateway in 1911, they kind of go through and they say, okay, well, you have folks like Lewis Tuttle, like the Thompsons, like Seward, like Horace S. Oakley. So Horace S. Oakley we have right there. That is the name on that claim that I showed you guys. And these were basically all people from Chicago who had never been to Alaska, no coal mining experience. They were secretaries, they were employees, they were lawyers who had all staked up these claims. And the goal was to consolidate them illegally into a kind of large coal field that would be controlled by the Alaska Northern Railway. So essentially within one day, one gentleman came out to the Matanuska Valley, staked up all the possible lands, and legal ownership was intended to eventually go to the railway. And this was a big scandal, right? So basically indictments were issued in 1911. Frost pretty much immediately flees the US to England, and it drags out in court for a couple of years. However, right, the United States has a lot of different interests going on. And while we saw in the Ballinger-Pinchot scandal, kind of conservationism and Pinchot won out in the Court of Public Opinion, in this case, with the trial in Chicago ends in 1913 with basically everyone being acquitted. Despite very hard evidence of, you can look through the claims and you can see, yep, these are all the right people. Everything's pretty well documented. They were found not guilty of conspiracy to control these coal acres. The judge kind of read the verdict and congratulated the defense, and then kind of refused to offer any comments anymore. So I think he was a little bit confused too. But in a way, a lot of this was a moot point, right? Because at that point, coal development throughout Alaska had still been shut down, again, from the federal government. And now we're kind of running into a time crunch because I guess, again, in retrospect, you could not have seen this portion of the graph, but we, can look at it and say, okay, well, coal's not going to last forever. So after some wrangling, they finally were able to open up coal for development in 1914. It took several years for the first mines to be built at Escott in 1917, Jonesville in 1920, and Chickalin in 1922. And at that point, we're kind of past the peak. So the takeaway from this is that those creeks kind of lost, like, sorry, I know I'm running out of time. These creeks basically lost their potable water because of coal development. Not a lot of coal was produced. And basically, starting in 1911, the U.S. Navy began transitioning to oil. By 1919, it was all on oil, and major Matanuska coal production kind of, kept on providing supplies to the local market, but it was never quite that federal dream, and it was never quite of national significance again. So finally wrapping up, it continued to be a pretty heavy item of local importance. This is a coal dollar, which apparently in the 1950s, the Jonesville mine paid all of their employees on these silver dollars that were marked with a sticker. So they would circulate throughout the local economy, and people would see them and realize, hey, how much of the economy is tied to coal? But this requires probably a lot more of a treatment than just 15 minutes. I think this is a really fascinating story of rights and responsibilities, and just going through the whole set of options of individual rights, native rights, corporate rights, federal rights. And it's a very good way to picture what could have been if things had gone just slightly different in Alaska. So thanks.
That's fascinating. No, that's fine. That was fascinating. Yeah, a history nerd. A history nerd, right? Yeah, another historian now. So yeah, our next week, a history geek. So now we're going to hear from a history geek, a professional historian, and this is Brian O'Reilly, who is from Eastern Washington, from Spokane. He is a historian. But he has close ties to Alaska because he did live in the village of Polygonik for 4 years, and he's very familiar with the Bristol Bay fishing industry. And he's going to be speaking about the rights and responsibilities of salmon fishing in Bristol Bay. So from two history nerds, now we're going to hear from a history geek. And then we'll have a good discussion. So these are great presentations. So I think you're just about set up.
It's not popping up the way I want. Come on, computer. That's not coming.
Yeah, it's just being funky. It's probably just doing
It's always the biggest challenge is the technical piece of this.
But isn't it fun to come to a small community? It's so fun. You have to just be a little more patient.
Here we go.
But it works.
Okay. And
So what button do I push?
I'm gonna take
I'd
that.
rather just use it on the
Oh,
laptop.
yeah,
if
we
it's
can do that
okay.
too. If you just give me a second, I'm gonna get the screen shared. And then it'll be this button here. You can just click over. See the little arrows. Oh, there.
Got
So
it?
yeah, this arrow right here.
Okay.
There you go.
Excellent. Thank you. Grab the little drink here. Well, Molly, thank you. The salmon that returned to Bristol Bay in Southwest Alaska have benefited generation after generation of Native Alaskans. For thousands of years, Yupik, Alutiiq, and Dena'ina peoples have harvested salmon from Bristol Bay and the many rivers that feed into it. Throughout the centuries, salmon have not only provided subsistence for these groups, but have played an important role in their cultural and spiritual identity. Alana Hurley, Executive Director of United Tribes of Bristol Bay, stated, "We are salmon people. But salmon are more than food for us. Salmon are central to our cultural identity, our spirituality, and our sacred way of life that has made us who we are for thousands of years in the Bristol Bay region." I am from Spokane, Washington, and I had the privilege of living in Kaliganek, Alaska, just north of Bristol Bay from 2014 to 2018. My wife is a school teacher, and it was her work that brought us north. Kaliganek sits on the western bank of the Nushagak River and is one of the main rivers for spawning Bristol Bay salmon. During my time living in Kaliganek, I became aware of just how economically important it is for those in the village who fish down in the bay to be successful. There are not a lot of jobs in small villages like Kaliganek, so profits made from the short fishing season in the bay are of the utmost importance. During my time spent in Kaliganek, I was introduced to the rhythms of Alaska Native lifeways, gathering berries, fishing for salmon, and catching a moose. I learned you don't kill a moose in Alaska, you catch it. As in, did you catch your moose yet? It was this exposure to the culture of my Native Alaskan friends that prompted me to write about this topic. Having had a love of fishing instilled in me as a child, the story of Native Alaskan peoples and their generational connection to Bristol Bay salmon is a topic I am very much interested in. Bristol Bay, located in southwest Alaska, covers an area of approximately 40,000 square miles, around the size of Ohio. It is the most valuable commercial salmon fishery in the world. It supports over 15,000 American jobs and is worth approximately $2 billion annually. Several major rivers empty into Bristol Bay, including the Togiak, Nushagak, Vitchak, Naknek, Igigik, and Dugashik. All 5 species of Pacific salmon, sockeye, reds, chinook, kings, coho, silvers, chum, dog, and pink humpies spawn and rear in the Bristol Bay watershed. The numbers of salmon taken from these waters each year is staggering. The typical sockeye salmon run averages around 38 million fish each year, and close to 50% of the world's yearly sockeye harvest comes from Bristol Bay. Today, I will give an overview of the history of salmon fishing in Bristol Bay. I will begin by looking at some of the first methods used to catch fish, followed by the emergence of commercial fishing during the sailboat period that began in the 1880s, and continuing with the introduction of the use of motorized fishing boats in 1951. With a brief overview of the history of commercial fishing in place, I will then examine today's Bristol Bay fishery and the challenges fishermen face, with a detailed look at limited entry and its impact on Native Alaskan populations. Yupik, Alutiiq, and Dena'ina peoples have been harvesting salmon from Bristol Bay and its rivers for thousands of years. Some say as far back as 10,000 years. There are numerous archaeological sites, including hunting camps and old villages along the rivers that flow into the bay. An example of one of these villages is Old Kaliganek. For scale, this is a picture of my wife in one of the home sites. Salmon were key to the survival of the people who lived in these dwellings. The first method used to catch the prized salmon was fish traps. At first, these were no more than sticks and rocks placed so as to divert the salmon into an enclosure, and then the fish were picked out by hand. Later on, more sophisticated fish traps like the one seen here were used. Eventually, nets came into use, and for the first time, fishermen could catch more fish than they could use. Commercial fishing began in Bristol Bay in 1884 when the Arctic Packing Company opened the first cannery at the mouth of the Nushagak River. This marked the beginning of the age of sailboats on Bristol Bay. Double-ender sailboats, the type that had already been in use on the Columbia River, were brought in for the fishery. Famed Bristol Bay historian Tim Troll describes the conditions that fishermen endured on the double-ender sailboats. In those days, fishing was extremely hard, miserable work. The double-enders were open and exposed to the often cold and wet weather of Bristol Bay. Catching fish in them was arduous work. Nets were set and pulled by hand. The nets, made of water-absorbent linen and wax-coated wood floats, were heavy even without fish in them. He goes on to say that fishing was a 24 hours a day, 6 days a week affair. The sailboats were owned by the canneries, who for the most part had a monopoly on the fishery. Fishermen were at the mercy of the canneries and had to lease their boats from them. Troll put it this way: fishermen were essentially indentured servants, and sailboats helped canneries keep them that way. Fishermen pushed for the use of motorized boats. One major reason was for safety. With the rapidly changing weather conditions, sandbars, and changing tides, sailing in the bay was a dangerous affair. Troll describes it this way: sailboats were bound to the wind, weather, and tides. A fisherman's greatest fear was getting stranded on a sandbar. Stranded double-enders often overturned when strong winds pushed the returning tide. A fisherman in the water was a dead fisherman. Without engines, there was little chance of escape or rescue. For years, the canneries pushed back against allowing motorized boats into the fishery. When asked why the salmon industry wanted to keep the sailboats, Harvey Samuelson, one of the old-time sailboat fishermen, responded, "Cheap operations, cheap way to get fish." As long as they could keep the sailboats going, the canneries could control the labor force, set the prices, and control the amount of catch. They knew that motorized boats meant independence for fishermen and the end of their monopoly, so they held out as long as they could. However, in 1948, many fishermen died when a strong wind pushed their sailboats onto a sandbar known as Dead Man's Sands. Eventually, the prohibition on motorized boats was repealed, and in 1951, they finally began to be used for fishing in the bay. The period of open access and motorized boats that began in 1951 was a time of significant change for the Bristol Bay fishery. The new motorized boats expanded fishing operations, increased catch capacity, and allowed for more mobility for fishermen who were now far less dependent on favorable weather conditions. The picture on the left is of a boat that was left behind in the village of Old Kaliganek. Perhaps this was one of the earlier motorized boats used to fish in Bristol Bay. The new advances brought about by motorized boats, however, had a downside. Because the fishery was open to anyone, and as competition increased, income per fisherman decreased. By the early 1970s, the number of people fishing in the bay simply couldn't be sustained. Overfishing and concerns about sustainability began to rise. By 1972, the salmon numbers had plummeted. In efforts to save the overcrowded fishing industry, in 1972, Alaska voters approved an amendment to the state constitution. The original wording stated, "No exclusive right or special privilege of fishery shall be created or authorized in the natural waters of the state." The amendment added the following: "This section does not restrict the power of the state to limit entry into any fishery for purposes of resource conservation, to prevent economic distress among fishermen and those dependent upon them for a livelihood, and to promote the efficient development of aquaculture in the state." The 1972 amendment paved the way for the Limited Entry Act of 1973, which allowed the state to establish a fixed number of permits for the various salmon fisheries. It has now been 50 years since the implementation of limited entry in the state of Alaska, and this has had profound repercussions for the Bristol Bay fishery and for Native Alaskan populations around the region. Understanding fully what those repercussions are is complicated, to say the least. Opinions vary greatly as to the efficacy of limited entry. However, this is not something new. Only 8 years after its implementation, in a 1980 report, Steve Langdon wrote the following: "Values, attitudes, and assumptions of different Alaskans will vary significantly about the relative importance of these elements in deciding what is to be done about limited entry and what is to be the proper place of Alaska's fisheries in the fabric of Alaskan society." Some argue that limited entry was a success. The salmon numbers over the past few years, at least in Bristol Bay, seem to lend some credibility to this argument. Others reluctantly agree that limited entry suffered from what Paula Cullenberg termed unintended consequences. We will take a look at some of those consequences in a moment. Yet others, like Jeremy Braithwaite, who wrote the article, "This is no longer a Bristol Bay fishery," use terms such as colonial violence to describe fishery management policies. Perhaps it would be unfair to categorize the implementation of limited entry as colonial violence. However, as the old adage goes, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. It was clear that in the early 1970s, changes needed to be made. Unfortunately, limited entry and the ways in which lawmakers and fisheries management officials implemented it fell short, especially when it came to the second objective mentioned in the amendment, to prevent economic distress among fishermen and those dependent upon them for a livelihood. Perhaps the biggest mistake that officials made was holding on to skewed assumptions about local native fishing practices. Their understanding that all fishermen were full-time, profit-driven with a competitive ethos and fully entrenched in the market economy did not reflect reality. J.S. Peterson informs us of the non-competitive and egalitarian ethic of Alaska Native peoples and points out that the methods of rural Alaska fishermen did not fit the individualization model of the limited entry permit system. Peterson continues, analysis describes a complex application process marked by confusing and limited information. If you didn't know how to exist in a Western paperwork world, you missed out. There was inadequate outreach in rural communities, along with a systematic failure to consider the cultural characteristics of rural Alaska Native fishermen. Due to language and cultural barriers, 30% of Bristol Bay residents who were eligible for a permit did not even apply. One example is that of a Native Alaskan fisherman who had fished in Togiak all his life. He missed out on a permit because he didn't speak English. While exclusions did occur from the outset with the initial allocation of permits, other dynamics have continued to perpetuate this exclusion. This graphic shows the average cost of a Bristol Bay drift permit from 1987 to 2023. Today, the average cost is from $150,000 to $200,000. The rising cost of permits makes it extremely challenging for local Native Alaskans to enter the fishery. I had the privilege of interviewing United Tribes of Bristol Bay Chief Strategy Director Shelley Cotton. Shelley is Native Alaskan, grew up in Dillingham, and has been around salmon fishing most of her life. Shelley had this to say, not allowing some way for local people that are from the area to gain entry without $100,000 in your pocket, without utilizing 6 programs and loans to get in, it's an injustice. It really is a barrier that's made up, and it's a barrier that is imposed unfairly. With the rising cost of permits, fishing boats, gear, and fuel, fewer young people have accessibility to commercial fishing. As a result, this has led to what many refer to as the graying of the fleet, meaning that the average age of Native Alaskans in the commercial fishery is going up. This raises concerns about the future of Native Alaskans' connection to the Bristol Bay fishery. These concerns are exacerbated by other issues as well. 44 years ago, Steve Langdon wrote the following prophetic words in his previously mentioned 1980 report. The outflow of permits that has occurred and that potentially can occur must be regarded as a significant threat to the rural Alaskan economic base and the well-being of rural Alaskans. Today, there are around 1,800 drift gillnet permits available for Bristol Bay, and over 50% of these are now owned by non-local individuals. The sale of permits to out-of-state fishermen has created a situation that few could have anticipated. In 2017, for example, 62% of gross earnings from the Bristol Bay driftnet fishery left Alaska as non-resident earnings. There are several studies that have been conducted examining the sale and transfer of permits, and the overriding factor seems to be economic. Shelley Cotton states, especially with the fluctuation in prices and the amount of fish, there are just so many things that make it difficult to keep your head above water if you're a fisherman, that you have to have a lot of cushion for those tough years. The decline of earnings by local fishermen has had negative economic and social impacts on many small rural communities across Alaska, communities where economic opportunities are extremely limited. It is important for us to consider how we interpret the historical facts surrounding limited entry. Our interpretation of what took place will impact our actions and our path forward. It is difficult to understand how a fisheries management system, one that has evolved to exclude so many Native Alaskans, was ever implemented. One interpretation attributes intentional maliciousness, or colonial violence, as Braithwaite puts it, on the part of officials and politicians involved in its implementation. However, as Professor Emeritus Gunnar Knapp of the University of Alaska Anchorage cautions, bad results are not necessarily the result of bad intentions. Other interpretations may stop short of assigning maliciousness, but still make it clear that officials and politicians are culpable for what has taken place. In the study by Donkersloot, participants described limited entry as a management system that stole the culture and the livelihood from the locals. I asked Shelley Cotton what she thought of limited entry, and she stated, "I think it really is an injustice to current generations of people. There wasn't foresight when they were framing limited entry." Another interpretation, perhaps like that offered by individuals like Alaska journalist Craig Madred, looks at the impact of limited entry as more of a result of broader impersonal forces. He states, "I don't think there was bad intent involved. I think there was a wish for a simple system that would be open, and they got a simple system, but in the end it wasn't open. It's theoretically open, but you need a shitload of money now to get in." Alaska's limited entry system transformed the right to fish into a tradable commodity. This fundamental change has had many consequences, whether intentional or not. The dynamics surrounding limited entry are not simple, and explanations still remain murky. Craig Madred states, "It's just a really complicated mess we've got." Gunnar Knapp adds, "The deeper you dig into it, the more complex it appears." There are reasons to be encouraged, however. In recent years, there have been measures taken to help mitigate some of the negative impacts of limited entry on Native Alaskan communities. Corporations like the Alaska Sustainable Fisheries Trust and Bristol Bay Economic Development Corporation, the BBEDC, are working hard to address inequities and help young people by providing economic opportunities, loans, permits, education, and internships. Shelley Cotton believes that discussing the impacts of limited entry is a good conversation to have, and that it needs to be talked about. In spite of the challenges associated with limited entry, Cotton's words reassure us that the connection Alaska Native peoples have had for centuries with salmon will continue for generations to come. This is our land. We were given this land. It is our responsibility to take care of it and utilize it. And so we have that connection to it. But we're not going anywhere. We're going to keep protecting our resources. We're going to keep using them. And we'll try to figure out a way to get our people back to being more involved, because it really needs to be that way. Thank you.
Come on, Tom. We're going to do a little question and answer here. We need one more chair.
You can grab mine. Yeah. Just watch my coffee cup there.
Can I take your coffee right here?
As long as you don't spill it, I think that's the goal, right?
Yeah. Okay, Tom, do you want to come up?
Sure.
Please sit over here. I think these were really great presentations, and they were very distinct because Tom really talks about the power of an individual, a single individual, and the influence that a single individual has on various industries and aspects of Alaska history. Garrett speaks to the timing of events. And if certain things had happened a little bit differently in timing, just think about how Alaska would have changed, and what things might have happened if the timing was just a little bit different. And then Brian really speaks to the power of laws and how those influence our activities and Alaska history. So I guess just looking at from those three elements, I guess my question would be to the three of you, listening to the others, would that change your talk in any way? Is there a little different perspective that you might have taken from the others listening to them today? And if you can't think about it, then we'll go to the audience.
I would add that rights of natives to to acquire mining claims because the lack of citizenship was very significant. And Alaska's, one of the most important platinum mines in the United States was discovered by a Yupik Eskimo. Yeah. It was discovered in 1925, a year after full citizenship was granted, and that's not a coincidence. It was a really good prospect if we think about it. Why bother if he lets people know about this? Someone's going to take it from him. And so when he was able to stake his own claims, he did so. That was very important because it was the only source of platinum in the United States for decades of time.
Timing of events.
Yeah.
Yeah. Any other comments from the speakers? Okay, how about the audience? Yeah, go ahead.
I had a question for Brian with limited entry. I was wondering if that policy was influenced by the fish-ins and the reaction against the fish-ins in places like Washington State and Great Lakes.
Do we need to repeat the question?
No.
Okay.
I don't think so.
Everybody heard? Yeah.
Just give a loud answer.
Okay.
So I hope this addresses your question. So at the time, there was only one template that the state of Alaska had for limited entry, and that was in British Columbia at the time. And so they saw some potential problems with that because they did see in the British Columbia, because they had introduced limited entry, that the sale of permits, for example. And so they tried to mitigate that from square one. They had a revolving fund set up, to try and help that. But I think, after I've had the privilege of interviewing several people for this research, and I've kind of come to realize that it really kind of seemed like it was this eventual percolating down where the availability to capital that Native Alaskan communities have is limited. So when the prices of permits had gone up so high, it really kind of was maybe almost inevitable. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Well, I was just wondering, because in the 1960s, a lot of the indigenous peoples of Washington State staged fish-ins, but for their treaty rights to push back against commercial fishing.
Right.
And so I was just wondering if this limited entry that then limited indigenous fishing rights, if that was a reaction to the indigenous peoples claiming their fishing rights in other areas.
Not really, because when they started limited entry, it was based on a point system, and these permits were given out. They were free, and so did they do a good job of including Native Alaskans in that? I'd say yes and no. Obviously, when there's cultural and language barriers that people didn't realize, 30% of people who were eligible didn't apply. So that they dropped the ball on that. But as far as this big pushback against that, not really. The Bolt decision was a big deal, for Washington State, but with the state of Alaska, the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, it kind of took that in a whole different direction. So there wasn't. I just don't see that there was necessarily cause for it at the time.
Did you want to comment, Tim?
No, I think that's true.
Yeah. Okay, another question? Yeah, back there. Yes, you.
Again,
I don't know your name. I
to
can't see
Brian,
it.
Any recommendation, like what if they had instead of an ownership in a permit, people, so they could sell a permit, instead of doing that, how about the state, a regulator, maintaining ownership of the permit, and then when somebody quits fishing it, it's open random process for the next person to.
Right.
Have you thought about any of those things?
Well,
Will you repeat it? I think the Zoom is having trouble.
Okay. The question is, was it considered rather than individual ownership that they could sell, that then if you weren't using it, it would kind of go back to the state, and then the state could either give it away again or do something with it, which.
I think to answer that, I think they thought it was a good idea to leave it open so, that it could be gifted, to family members and things like that, which one of my really good friends in Kalignac, that's exactly what happened to him. He started fishing in the bay at age 6, bringing a set net for his father. And so I think they saw that as a good thing back in the day. But the fact that these permits got so expensive, and even now, I mean, $200,000. Yeah, so.
And I think Tim can speak to this a little bit more, but I know the state in the past has tried, there's a certain percentage of permits that don't get fished. And so as part of kind of consolidating the fishery, the state has tried to adopt policies to buy back certain permits, but that seems like that really hasn't ever worked very well, or it hasn't been allowed, or haven't had the money to do it or something. And Tim, you can
I
probably
think it's one of
speak.
those things that's always on the drawing board, but to
Yeah.
a large extent, it's water under the bridge. I mean, we create proprietary rights now on these things that you just can't take them back arbitrarily by any means. So that's a real issue. I think in the early days, it was thought that many people would give their permits or pass them along to families, but when you get into an economic crisis and all of a sudden you have some asset here, you have a lot more this could also happen. It's worth a lot of money. It's pretty hard to not sell it.
And if you have 5 kids, how do you split it among 5 kids? And
And I would add to that, so the Bristol Bay Economic Development Corporation, so the way I kind of understand it, they're getting about 6 to 7 permits in the hands of young people every year. But the sale to out of state is still like 12 a year. So they're still not gaining any ground on that. But they're trying, they're going that direction.
Question or statement to Brian. I was working up in Bristol Bay in the late 70s, early 80s, and I actually wrote a master's thesis at Chicago about another thing going on economically that I saw with my UPIC friends, colleagues working in the fish plants, and that was a 2-union system. At a lot of the plants, they had a resident cannery workers union and a non-resident, and it broke up the collective bargaining power of the cannery workers. The non-residents were paid less, although at my plant, they actually upped the non-residents to equal. But I saw a lot of my friends who were UPIC, who fathers and others were, some of them got permits, some of them just didn't understand the process at the time, or so there was a lot of misinformation, just like enrolling IC and ANCSCA corporations, kind of the same time frame, a little slightly different, but I looked at that as kind of a bit of an economic barrier on the labor level. These young men wanting to be able to buy a boat or net, and that was an important part of the cash economy, because a lot of them, as Van Stone and others said, were part of this dual economy. A lot of them would, as soon as they were done in the plant, go off and go fishing for themselves and go off, hunting and other stuff. So the cannery wages for those who were trying to move up and get it, a set net permit or a drift net permit, that was really key, and that was kind of a barrier. So it's something to think about, and we can talk about more, but nobody's really written on that aspect of things, but I think it's key.
yeah, back there.
I heard, again, for Brian, I sort of picked up this.
Fishing is big, salmon is big,
Tim, would
as,
you like to-
I was going to ask a question about mining, actually.
yeah, he had a question. Oh, good, you have a question about mining. Okay, go ahead. Your question?
I understood there was discussions about, on the local level, acquiring permits by a government form, either a tribal government, a corporation, that could then be, local people within that, associated with that group, could then, lease or somehow use that permit. Is that?
So the question for those on Zoom was the possibility of local governments or corporations or tribes forming some kind of an entity that could then purchase permits on behalf of their local area. And I'm not sure, I don't know. Yeah.
I think there's lots of avenues that can be taken, and I do think that native corporations are key to that. I will say that a few people that I've talked to, and even Shelley Cotton, who is Native Alaskan, they really see it as this needs to be, not necessarily fixed, but addressed at the political level. And that's the real challenge, because a lot of, maybe people at the state, I know, it's a difficult topic, but that's really where it needs to be to get any changes done. And whether, and what role the Native Alaskan tribes play in that, I'm not sure.
Tim, you had a question, a mining question?
Yeah, I was curious, your map of all the coal resources being on the East Coast, and that was the reason to focus on Alaska. And then you have Teddy Roosevelt, who was like the father of the Great White Fleet, that was sailing all around the world, wanted to lock up the coal in Alaska that he would have potentially needed for those ships, or was there a transition from oil to coal to oil right about that time?
So the lockup would have been 1906.
Can you repeat the question real quick?
For sure. So the question is there's a dichotomy here in behavior on Teddy Roosevelt's, and Teddy Roosevelt was an incredibly complex person. But on the one hand, he is this expansionist, imperialist. I mean, he basically advocated for taking over Canada and Mexico if he could. And as Tim mentioned, sailed all over the world, took over the Philippines, Cuba. So why would a man who had those ambitions have wanted to lock up the fuel resources that could have made it possible? And frankly, I don't know. That is a very good question. He had, again, I think he was dedicated to conservationism, perhaps more than he was dedicated to expansionism, perhaps. That's pure speculation. I would definitely turn to folks like Douglas Berkeley, who wrote The Wilderness Warrior. It's a really good book about Roosevelt's philosophy. You'd asked about the timing of it, and the lockup happens in 1906 to 1909, where the transition of petroleum happened in 1911 to 1919. So this was kind of a big gamble, right? This was before it was known that oil could potentially replace coal as a predominant fuel. So I guess that's beyond my pay grade, but it's an excellent question.
Well, they had a Boston Tea Party event here in Cordova, and they dumped hundreds of tons of coal in the harbor out here.
Really?
Yeah, I'll send you some stuff like that.
What
Because they
year
were
was that?
protesting the lockup of the coal.
Oh.
But I
what year
think
is that?
maybe it was because he wanted to keep it away from the corporation heads like the group. I think that's more the reason.
You don't think Roosevelt just knew that there was going to be a shift from coal to oil, so I can lock up all the coal anyway?
Yeah.
He
Oh, that's
seen it
interesting,
coming
huh?
for a lot of people.
Yeah, go ahead. Back there.
I want to go back in time to that cool graph you have.
You're the first person to ever say cool graph.
So as you look at the production of, or the use of energy in wood burning, declining, coal is coming up. So at that intersection, which of those two has a greater environmental cost?
Oh, that's a good question too. So 1872 was the low point of forest cover on the East Coast. And in a lot of ways, it's an interesting question, right? Because it kind of reminds me of when plastic bags were invented. They were supposed to be the environmentally friendly option to reduce cutting wood for paper bags. So that's a great question.
I think especially its impact on climate change.
Absolutely.
What is our reverse lens on that now? Yeah. Thank you.
Unintended consequences that sometimes you don't know at the time you make the decision, and then it's after, and then often it's very difficult to undo a decision that's made. Yeah, go ahead. Oh, no, yeah, go ahead. Or who hasn't asked a question yet? You already made a lot of comments. You asked a question. Anybody else? Yeah, right here. Sorry, guys.
Yeah, so I have a question for each of you, I guess perhaps less for the person who you're describing, but more for the mining industry in general. But what examples would you say are policies or systems that you folks researched in your presentations or just in your life, I guess, for what you do, that were designed to improve over time as opposed to be solutions for that moment? And that could only be redressed by a similar large political effort. And I come to that question from a background in public administration where, I know policies can be designed with sunsets and points at which they're supposed to be addressed again with new public input. And it seems like the examples that you all gave were things that were kind of like waterfall designs of like, we're going to say this is how it's going to be and this is how it's going to be, period.
So did the Zoom people hear that question? I don't know, my Zoom moderator just left, so. Anyway, it's were any of these points of law or decision-making, was there anything built in that would require some kind of a review or a look at, 10, 20 years down the road, with it like a sunset or something like that? I'm not sure any of them have. I mean, the 1872 Mining Act is still in place.
Yeah, it is,
Yeah.
with many, many modifications. So
It's still the basic law. Limited entry, I don't think there's been it. That was a constitutional amendment, so I'm not sure the laws have been changed. I'm looking at Tim. I don't think so.
A lot of national forests, it's executive order, so that kind of is, it's not ideal, it's not planned, but that's kind of the update process of, whoever's in office looks at it and says, well, no, and yep, and
Yeah, I didn't realize that Chugach Forest was that large for 20 years or some period of time and then got scaled back. And I guess executive orders have been changed over time, so that would be a decision-making process and often that's a political process, not necessarily a thoughtful reanalysis of the decision. But I think we're out of time here. I want to give a hand to our three speakers. I think they did a great job with and just remind people that this is has been recorded. And so you'll be able to also see it again. I'm not sure when it gets posted to the web, but we'll have it available. So thanks. We have an hour for lunch. Lunch is on your own. Good luck.
Brewery has grab and go sandwiches.
Right.
Hideaways across the street. There's 2 delis at each of the grocery stores.
Perfect.
Those would be your best bets.
Okay, thank you. I thought the brewery wasn't open until 3.
The brewery is not open until 3 because there's a restaurant inside of it.
Perfect.
They have some grab and go sandwiches.
Perfect. Good to know.
So come to the auditorium at 1:30.
At 1:30, the auditorium at 1:30. For your special session.
Entrance
Yeah,
underwater.
yes,
stuff.
great. Okay.
so it's influenced maybe not the presentations, that a lot of my understanding has been pretty.